Hi, everybody. I am Felicity Gosser. I'm a specialist with the CDBG program. Thank you for being here today. This is a fraud, waste, and abuse training that is mandatory for CDBG grantees, and we made it mandatory for the whole Division of Federal Financial Assistance. Thanks to everybody for being here for this important training. Our presenters today are going to be from ICF, who is our consulting firm for the CDBG CV grant, and we're really glad to have them presenting. Before we get started, I want to let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded, so by attending, you're consenting to being recorded. And if you have questions during the presentation, please put them into the chat, and we will review them at the end of the presentation and respond. Because it's a large number of people in attendance, that's how we're planning to handle the interaction. So without further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Sue Southern with ICF, and Sue, take over, and I see some questions coming into the chat, and we can answer those as we go. Anything I missed, Sue?
Nope, not anything. I want to say good morning, say hi, and then I'm going to go off camera to make sure we've got enough bandwidth to keep this going. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm delighted to meet all of you virtually. As Felicity said, I'm Sue Southern, and I'm with ICF. We've already talked about putting your questions in the chat, and we're going to have time to answer those, as many as we can at the end. But if we don't get to yours, we will make sure that you get an email or some other form of response. Next slide, Kathy, please. So this is our agenda for this morning. And as you can see from the slide, the goal of this training is to help all of you to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. But let me say before we start that even the very best managed agencies and municipalities may have occasion to confront fraud, waste, and abuse at various times. It tends to be a bit more prevalent, we found, when we're dealing with what we would call disaster environments, whether that be COVID or a flood or a fire or a hurricane. Because unfortunately, these types of events bring out bad actors who see opportunities to prey on people when they're the most vulnerable. And by the end of the session, that we want you to be able to recognize fraud, waste, and abuse, to take action against it if you see it, and most importantly, to prevent it. Next slide, please, Kathy. Okay, let's get started. Next slide. Okay, we wanted to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of what we're talking about here. Most of you, I believe, are quite easily able to identify fraud when you see it. And I'm sure most, if not all of us, unfortunately, may have been the victims of credit card fraud at one time or another. The problem we've got now is that crooks are becoming much more sophisticated in the perpetration of fraud. And that includes not just the kind of personal fraud that you may encounter, but fraud that impacts our organizations. When there's federal funding out there and available. In terms of waste, this one's a little bit more difficult to identify. And one of the best examples I can give you, perhaps, is a beneficiary program where the grantee or the subrecipient puts a large number of applicants through an extensive intake process, conducts environmental reviews, even maybe requires to do damage assessments, and then never provide services to the vast majority of these people. And all of the funding that's spent on those for whom a national objective is never met is wasted money. And it also, quite honestly, can be subject to repayment by HUD. And finally, abuse is what we most often see when an employee uses an organizational resource for private use. Could be a car or a credit card. These are the two most common. But depending on the circumstances, that can also constitute fraud. Next slide, Kathy, please. The Federal Register requires grantees and subrecipients to attend fraud-related training provided by the HUD OIG to support the compliant administration of federal funds. And I believe most of you probably have already had that HUD OIG or Office of Inspector General training, and this is going to be just a refresher for you. But some of the subrecipients may not have had it, and this will help you to educate them on fraud, waste, and abuse as well. And this training will be available for your use once it's posted. Determining whether or not your subrecipients have a fraud, waste, and abuse policy should be part of your initial risk analysis. If they don't, help them to develop one or encourage them to adopt yours. Each of your organizations should have a fraud, waste, and abuse policy and clearly outline the circumstances under which fraud might occur, fraud, waste, or abuse might occur, the agency requirements and protocol should it be suspected. As I mentioned earlier, with beneficiary programs, fraudulent activities sometimes seen at intake, most commonly things like falsifying documents to claim eligibility. But many programs require that these suspected cases be referred to your local prosecuting attorney or police for further investigation as the first step. You're going to see some examples of this later on in our presentation. Another place where fraud is often found is with contractors. Taking deposits and not doing the work is probably the most common form of contractor fraud that we see. Kathy, next slide, please. So what does the Office of the Inspector General do? It is an independent office, and by independent, I mean it operates strictly on its own. It reports to the HUD Secretary, Congress, and the public regarding problems, deficiency, and corrective actions as it relates to HUD-specific programs. There are certain activities that are going to attract the OIG interest and result in an investigation. Examples of these would include things like contract awards that don't follow procurement rules, excessive personal spending by staff that's inconsistent with salaries, large and undocumented draw requests, and extension. This one you may see more frequently soon, and that's extension requests where there's no administrative funds that remain. If you're considering taking on a new subrecipient or contractor, it's always a good idea to check the OIG website to see if they've been involved in any findings. And you'll see that web address right on the bottom of this slide. Another good place to look as part of your risk assessment for subrecipients or local governments is the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. We will provide the link to that Federal Audit Clearinghouse at the end of this presentation. But from that, you can find, from the audits that you see there, you can find documentation of issues that they may have had in managing other federal grant funds or other internal control problems. This will assist you when you start to structure your grant conditions. Next slide. This slide lists the most common types of fraud investigations that are undertaken by HUD's OIG. And I think most of these things you're going to recognize: grant fraud, contractor fraud, landlord-tenant fraud, identity theft. Some of these are more directly related to HUD's FHA activity. However, for any of you that are running either homebuyer programs or homeowner repair programs, some of the investigations related to these FHA loan programs may be relevant to you as well. So for an example, mortgage fraud refers to the deliberate act of lying or omitting information that's used by the mortgage underwriter, which in this instance may be you or a subrecipient, to fund, purchase, or insure a mortgage loan. It can be committed by either the borrower or the mortgage lender. Bankruptcy fraud is the act of falsifying information when filing for a bankruptcy, and it can take the form of filing for bankruptcy to deceive creditors. And finally, equity skimming is mortgage fraud committed by skimming the equity from a property that's part of a subprime lending refinancing. Oftentimes, we see this when the homeowner is in default on the mortgage or real estate taxes and is offered a loan to prevent immediate foreclosure. We saw some of these with NSP, perhaps less likely now. Next page, please. Now we're going to focus on fraud, so you become more familiar with the red flags that may indicate that fraud is occurring. So it can take a lot of different forms. At its most basic, it's lying or misrepresenting facts for personal gain. As we mentioned earlier, it is a bit more prevalent with disaster response programs where there's an urgency to move funding to those most in need, possible pressure to significantly reduce pre-disbursement requirements, and potential political pressure to use certain contractors or subrecipients. Next slide, please. If you think about instances of fraud of which you may be aware, it's very likely that you're going to be able to identify the elements that created something we refer to as the fraud triangle: financial pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. Next slide. Financial pressure can be personal or professional. As you see here, personal could be things like gambling debt, home and foreclosure, unexpected major medical expenses, divorce. Professional is a little bit different, and in the early stages, it's not uncommon for staff to feel or get pressure to process applicants quickly, to spend grant funds fast, even though there may be a risk that many of those beneficiaries will never achieve a national objective. Or there can be professional financial pressure that may take the form of supervisors encouraging staff to ignore program policies and procedures in the interest of faster spending. Opportunities for fraud arise when programs have lax internal controls and inadequate supervision. So in other words, a lack of checks and balances. When one person has approval authority over more than one aspect of a process that leads to disbursement of federal funds, this creates an opportunity for fraud. And we'll give you an example of that a little bit later on. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, trusted and competent employees can commit fraud, and many will rationalize it in some of the ways that you see listed on this slide. I think you'd likely be shocked at some of the individuals who actually commit fraud, and you have to wonder, what in the world were they thinking? I'm going to give an example of this. It was particularly alarming to me. It was a personal example. We were working on the Sandy recovery program for the state of New Jersey, and there was a woman who was on the staff of our program from the state agency. Her husband was also a state employee, and they decided to claim their second home as their primary residence for the purpose of getting a grant to repair storm damage. It was discovered because we had really good controls and checks and balances on the application process. It turns out both were sentenced to jail time, both lost their jobs, both lost their state pensions. The fraudulent grant was for less than $150,000. Next slide, please. So, as we mentioned, employees can be sources of fraud. Unfortunately, they can and do commit fraud, not only as direct applicants, but also in collusion with others. And that collusion could involve vendors, as you see in this example that's listed on the slide. Can also be a situation where an intake employee is in collusion with an applicant to falsify information and gain grant resources. With new funds, organizations often need to bring on additional staff or temporary staffing agencies to help them manage the new flow of applicants and the flow of funds. Background checks are critical here to make sure that you know with whom you're entrusting both precious federal resources and your organizational reputation. Next slide. Clients are also sources of fraud, unfortunately. our clients and vendors, given an opportunity, may commit fraud as well. And this slide gives some examples of client fraud when the client happens to be a homeowner. This, as I mentioned earlier, this type of fraud can also occur in other CPD programs, home programs, CDBG programs that provide resources based on verification of home ownership, of income, and of residency. See these most often in either the home buyer programs or the home repair programs. Next slide. Vendors. Contractor fraud is one of the most common forms of fraud when disaster funding is involved. And the reason for this is because you get a tremendous influx of funds and a great need to move those funds quickly. And that this funding will attract contractors not only from all over the US, but for example, with Sandy, we were getting contractors from Central and South America. The same was true with the hurricanes that were experienced in Florida and Louisiana. One way to kind of guard against this is to rely on, to the extent possible, your local resources to help you vet contractors. This could be local building officials, it could be trade organizations, it could be, for example, your local building council, your builders councils. Always require proof of proper licensure and check SAMs to make sure that there is no debarment action for any of those contractors. Next slide, please. So this next group of slides, we're going to look at some common fraudulent activities that occur when federal funds are involved and the types of fraud that we may see when these federal funds are involved. Next slide. Bribery is probably one that comes to mind early. So somebody's giving or offering something financial to influence an official act. These are the ones that the OIG most often encounters. Bribery is most frequently seen between employees and a vendor or a contractor. And interestingly enough, it's easier to trace to those who get the money than those who give the money. And there have been instances with grantees with whom I've worked where the Justice Department and FBI were able to, through subpoenaing personal records, see exactly what was being provided to the employee, but they've never been able to figure out where the money's coming from. So unfortunately, that makes prosecution very difficult. Things to look for: procurement activities are one place where you're apt to see clues of bribery. The other places where you're seeing repeated program policy or procedural violations that appear to benefit certain contractors. Next slide. Bid rigging is another type of fraud that you see during the procurement process. It can occur in a number of ways. So if a program staff provides pricing information to a selected bidder or bidders, but not to all bidders, or it could be where a contractor controls the bids of other contractors, either through side agreements or acting as a front for another contractor. Unfortunately, I have a good example of this from Detroit, which is where I'm located. A contractor friend of a former mayor of ours was involved in a bid rigging when we had a substantial inflow of federal funding for demolition contracts. And basically he was providing bids using a whole variety of organizations as fronts for his organization. He was still in prison for that, by the way. They caught him and he's still in jail, even though the mayor isn't. Next slide, please. So documentation is another form of fraud. Again, sometimes you see this with intake documents that have been falsified to prove eligibility. You may see impropriety with regard to financial transactions. And this can either be deliberate or something that the OIG refers to as deliberate ignorance on the part of those involved. An example of deliberate ignorance would be where there's, for example, a drawdown from a treasury account without having the backup documentation to validate that the funds have been appropriately spent, as most of these draws are direct reimbursement. Refusal to turn over documents pursuant to a contract is another form. And destroying documents has happened in some instances, which makes it very, very difficult sometimes to close out your grant. One of the best ways to prevent this is to make sure that all of your subrecipients and your contractors are aware of record retention requirements and stress the fact that the timeline on that doesn't start until your entire grant closes out, because in many instances, they will assume that once their project is over, their responsibility for retention of documents is finished. Next slide, please. Billing schemes, again, another example of potential fraud. And this usually involves false invoices or altered invoices, or accepting poor or non-existent documentation and making a payment. It can be careless or it can be criminal. But as mentioned on a prior slide, IDIS or DRGR drawdowns should have backup documentation and invoices that balance to the penny the amount drawn from Treasury. And these documents are really important to hold on to and make sure you have complete records. Next slide, please. Conflict of interest. There's a couple of different levels of this, and you see both of them mentioned on this slide. And undisclosed is the key here. The two levels, and the first, an employee may or may not have any direct gain, financial gain from an action, but the conflict could result in the organization overpaying for a good or a service. And this could also happen when you have an employee who may not be directly involved in decision-making as it relates to federal resources, but wants to be an applicant in a program, like a first-time home buyer program or a repair program. The second level that's referenced on this slide involves an employee getting a direct financial gain as a result of that conflict. So these are the things we'd suggest. If there's a potential for conflict of interest, it's best to document it and ask HUD for review. It's also really important that you have a good conflict of interest policy that spells out what constitutes a conflict of interest, and creates firewalls if necessary to protect employees. There are some ways that you can mitigate conflict of interest, and your policy may specify those clearly, or again, you can ask HUD for some direction on that. But the one guidance I would give you is, if you're not comfortable with the situation, in other words, if you think that someone outside of your organization looking at it would think what we say doesn't pass a sniff test, then it's better to take the person with potential conflict of interest out of the equation altogether. Better be safe than sorry. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide shows examples of where procurement set aside for preferred classification of vendors could conceivably result in fraud. Most often what we see here is that a non-preferred vendor uses a member of a preferred class of vendors to secure procurement advantage, where the DBE, MBE, WBE actually serves as a front for bid purposes. Another way that this happens is where a vendor fraudulently obtains certification as a preferred vendor class that they don't actually deserve. Next slide. So next, we're going to take a look at the most commonly seen types of fraud by type of program. Next slide. So fraud and cross-cutting programs. These first four of these you probably easily recognize, but you should also be aware of social media scams related to federal financing that we're seeing more often, unfortunately, now. Couple of examples of these are fake government websites that draw people into the process to collect their information, or websites that request a fee to assist an applicant to either make application for a program or expedite processing for a program. So it's good to have your folks kind of keeping on the lookout on social media for those kinds of websites. Identity theft is also possible with beneficiary programs where you're collecting and maybe storing various forms of personally identifiable information. All of your staff should receive training and proper handling of PII. The Department of Homeland Security has an online course that provides a completion certificate, and we've provided a link to that training at the end of this presentation. Not a bad idea to have everybody do that on an annual basis, just as a refresher, to make sure that everybody's sensitive to how you appropriately handle personally identifiable information. Next slide. So in a beneficiary program, these are the typical kinds of activities where you may see fraud. Failure to disclose other benefits that they may have received, misrepresentation of facts to claim eligibility, and contractor fraud. And with contractor fraud, it's most likely to be asking for advance payments or money up front and then failing to actually do the work, or starting a job and then disappearing. Could be misrepresentation of licensure status. The other thing we sometimes see, and again, this is where you need to be heavily reliant on your construction experts, your program inspectors, is where you've got a contract that will call for a certain standard grade of materials, and yet you find upon inspection that the materials being used by the contractor are substandard or cheaper alternatives. Next slide, please. Rental assistance programs are another place where we see fraud. Because they present opportunities for fraud, including bribery, false documents, conflict of interest, harassment, and extortion. For these kinds of programs, it's really critical to maintain a separation of duties to provide your program with sufficient internal control. I'm going to give you an example of a former client many years ago I had, and this was a CAP agency that provided homeless services to the homeless and rental assistance. And because they were short-staffed and they got a new grant, they allowed a caseworker to be responsible for eligibility determination, for locating an acceptable unit, for approving a lease, and for approving rent payments. So unfortunately, what they found is that she created a fictitious client, a fictitious unit, a fictitious landlord, and paid herself over $600,000 in benefits before she was finally discovered. And this was an agency that ironically had been rewarded recognition for being one of the best managed nonprofits. But it can happen if you don't have those checks and balances and the internal controls. Next slide, please. Committing fraud has consequences. Next slide. So the OIG has 3 options for enforcement: criminal enforcement, civil enforcement, or administrative action. What I've typically seen with criminal actions is that they will reach out and partner with the Department of Justice and the FBI. So if you see those guys knocking on your door, that means that they have a fairly good sense that there's something that they need to take a much closer look at. It's very important that you cooperate with them, because OIG likes to work in partnership, and with the cooperation of grantees, it just makes everything easier. Next slide, please. So this is an example of criminal penalties, and this is another sandy one because they ended up with over $4 billion and a lot of people in need of services. And initially, they structured their program in such a way that the homeowners could do their own contracting, and they were just kind of vetting those contractors as they went. But again, pressed to move money fast to make sure that people got services. So they had a number of instances of contractor fraud. I will say that there was a very good system of checks and balances in there, so they were able to catch it fairly early on in most instances. The protocol, because it was a state agency that was administering the program, is anything that was suspect was immediately referred to the Attorney General. And they did the investigation, they did the prosecution, and they were highly publicized. And I think the grantee, if asked, would tell you that they think that this served a significant detriment to having more contractor fraud than they actually had. So in this instance, this contractor took money from multiple homeowners and then just disappeared and didn't do the work. How we found him was we got a complaint from a homeowner who said, you know, I've given these people money and they've kind of disappeared on me. So immediately the protocol was to go into the applicant records and identify all the applicants that may have been using this particular contractor. Rather than reaching out to them and saying, you know, we think this guy is a bad actor, what we did is we reached out and said, are you happy with the services you're getting? And ended up, that was the way we discovered that it was 1.4 million that they had managed to take from people without providing any services. Next slide, please. There may also be civil as well as criminal penalties as a result of a finding of fraud. And I mentioned this earlier, but I want to stress it again, that last bullet is really important. Ignorance from someone in a position where the expectation is that they should have knowledge is not a defense against fraud. It's not just falsification of documentation related to vendors or contractor payments. It can also be the result of inadequate accounting practices that result in erroneous transactions, such as more being drawn from the treasury account than can be supported by invoices, or payments being made to vendors with no documentation. And this is important why it's really critical to make sure that anytime you're making a draw from the treasury, the grantees, that you have the backup documentation to support the amount to be drawn to the penny. Overdrawing can result in repayment. It results in loss of program opportunities, and it also may result in the inability of you to close out your grants. Next slide. The last thing that OIG is able to do is to levy administrative penalties, and you see the list here on the slide. And these are the types of penalties. Administrative penalties are typically used for contract violations, doing business with a departed entity or person, although I have known a couple of instances where the grantee should have known better and repayment was required. And it's also willful violation of a statutory or a regulatory provision that's applicable to your public agreement. Next slide. The next few slides are going to give you suggestions regarding the steps your organizational leadership can take to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. Next slide. So have strong written policies and procedures. They should have a lot of detail for both programmatic and financial management responsibilities. Have a code of conduct, train on it, and have every employee sign an acknowledgement that they are aware of it and they understand it. And per HUD requirements, all contracts and agreements should have milestones or deliverables and liquidated damages clauses. And it's not on this slide, but I really want to stress this. Have an internal auditor. This is not just a suggestion, but for many of the programs that you guys are administering, it's a HUD requirement. And sub-grantees start out with an internal auditor and then they leave and never get replaced. That position reports to the highest governing body in the organization. So if you're a city, it should report to your city council. If you're a county, your county commission. And if you're a state, your state legislature and your governor. Program staff should not have the ability to silence them or restrict their reporting. But using information collected by an internal auditor can help you identify, target, and quickly curtail any potential irregularities that could result in fraud, waste, or abuse. It helps you to see the weaknesses in the program and address any gaps. Next slide. Duties. Procedures should identify how the person or position responsible for each step in your workflow is to function. It highlights where there's a separation of functions, and those should occur to maintain strong internal controls. Also have a clear understanding of your contract documents. Work directly with your legal counsel to get an understanding of their willingness to enforce contractual requirements. Unwillingness to enforce contractual requirements or provisions basically renders a contract useless and opens you as grantees to findings and repayment. And unfortunately, I see this more often than not. You get a good agreement or a good contract, and then when there's a violation of that development agreement, your corporation counsel just doesn't want to pursue legal action, which is unfortunate because typically what ends up happening is that the municipality is responsible for paying back HUD money. Next slide, please. Provide training. Adequate training is really critical to ensuring that the staff understands the policy and procedures governing the various aspects of the programs that they oversee. 2 CFR Part 200 covers administration, procurement, and cost principles for all federal contracts, whether you're a direct grantee or represent a pass-through organization. Think about making sure that the individuals in your organizations most apt to come in contact with fraud, waste, and abuse have this training. Already referenced training for PII, and they need to be conversant with 2 CFR Part 200, 318 through 326, which are the federal procurement requirements. And I will tell you that at this particular time, we're seeing a lot more HUD and OIG focus on looking at how grantees and subrecipients are managing procurement, and folks are getting findings. Next slide, please. Another way is good record keeping. Use file checklists to ensure that all your files are complete and the documentation is legible, accurate, and thorough. Make sure your contracts and subrecipient agreements clearly specify the expectations with regard to documentation, the period of retention, and make sure that critical documents are not destroyed. Next slide. You probably all already have an ethics policy, but how many of your staff are aware of it and really understand it? Most organizations have that policy, but there may not be any specific training on it, or it may be a 20-minute session when you're onboarding a new employee. Make sure that employees receive regular, and we recommend annual, ethics refresher courses. It just helps keep it top of mind what's so important. And then think through each of your programs and identify where those vulnerabilities might exist. Work with your program managers to mitigate those risks through training, supervision, and internal controls. Next slide. Forms. So many of your grant agreements are now going to mandate that you include a fraud notice on anything that's signed by a subrecipient or a beneficiary applicant. Be sure that your contracts have all the required HUD clauses and that all conform to the contractual requirements of 2 CFR Part 200. And these are specifically that they have a specific contract amount, a specific period of performance, specific either milestones or deliverables by which you and your staff can monitor progress, and a liquidated damages clause. Next slide. Develop specific anti-fraud policies. Make sure that your policies clearly identify the protocols to be followed if fraud, waste, or abuse is suspected. Do this fraud training with your staff generally because it'll help them be thinking about things to look at. Next slide. Monitoring for fraud. So here's some monitoring tips. Critical steps that you could take when you're monitoring your programs that will aid you in the detection and prevention of fraud. Always have an independent cost estimate. Always do a debarment check. And make sure that your billing and your invoices matches purchase orders and contracts. This includes change orders. Next slide, please. So in terms of micro purchasing and small purchases, vary your vendors if it's feasible, because it may give you better pricing if you're circulating the work around. Structure your agreement so that financial documentation of expenditures must be produced when requested. And be alert for some of the items that you see on this slide that could indicate that fraud is occurring. Assign responsibility for reviewing and approving invoices at both the program and the finance level. So these two categories of staff are going to be looking for different things when they're reviewing invoices, which is great. It gives you checks and balances. It also helps to verify that all costs charged to the grant are eligible, reasonable, and allocable. Next slide. So if you allow agreements or subrecipients to use organizational credit cards, which we don't necessarily recommend, this slide outlines some suggestions on how to validate costs charged to the card to the grant are appropriate. So look at specific invoices and receipts to match credit card statements, and be particularly aware of purchases that show that materials may have been credited or later returned. And also be sure that your staff is aware that if they refer to 2 CFR 402-413, they can get a whole list of expenses that are never eligible for federal reimbursement. And this is important. Next up. So to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse, define eligibility, incorporate certifications and fraud acknowledgements, use checklists, maintain good notes, record submittal methods, and involve the OIG early at the first indication that you may have a problem. Next slide. Don't hide your dirty laundry. As I mentioned at the beginning of this session, occurrence of fraud is not necessarily a sign of a poorly run or mismanaged agency. It's how you handle it that defines the quality of your management. Existence of a fraud policy and the proper handling of fraud is a deterrent to bad actors, whether they be clients, vendors, or employees. Next slide, please. These are the items that should be reported. Check your agency policy regarding reporting policy and protocols for suspected fraud, waste, and abuse. But remember, reporting to the OIG can always be done anonymously. Next slide, please. So if you want even more information than you've gotten in the last 45 minutes, the link on this slide, and you're going to be getting access to these slides, will give you direct access to the OIG's website. Next slide. And this slide refers to the two things that I discussed in the presentation. One is the online Department of Homeland Security PII training, and the other is the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, which is a wealth of information and not particularly search. And it will provide you with, it may give you some red flags that you need to be aware of as you start structuring your agreements with your subrecipients or developers. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Anne now and Felicity for any questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Sue. That was great. One of the first questions in the chat was one where you were talking earlier on a slide, and I think you just wrapped right back up to it about the Audit Clearinghouse. When you had mentioned that, someone asked if that was the same as SAM.gov. And so I think it would be good to repeat that the Federal Audit Clearinghouse through HUD OIG is to search for prior OIG or audit findings, and that the SAM.gov debarment check is to search for debarred businesses, and both are recommended to avoid fraud, waste, and abuse.
Actually, there's 3 of them. So there's the 2 that Ann just mentioned. But the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. So when you're working with HUD funds and subrecipients, well, actually, all of you guys, grantees and subrecipients, and some nonprofits, depending on how much federal funding they get, and the threshold is now $750,000 annually, are required to have a current audit. So as you go through your risk assessments, one of the first things you're going to ask for is give us a copy of your federal audit. So if they don't have one or they don't provide one, then the next place to look is what they call the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. It's a public website. It's available to anybody. It's you kind of have to play with it because sometimes the searches are more difficult, but you can start with and we probably should have pulled up the site, but for anybody who's interested, we can figure out maybe a quick training later just to show you how to search it, but it's really pretty easy. You can search. What you will probably want to do is search by auditee name, and it will pull up a list of all of the audits that have been submitted, and there's 2 ways to do it. There's a form on that site that gives you kind of a summary, although not a really good one. But there's also going to be a link to their actual audit, which they've submitted to the Audit Clearinghouse. And that, as you go through it, will give you information on notes to the audit. It will give you a list of the federal grants if they're managing federal grants. It will give you notations if there have been issues with management of federal grants. It will also give you notations on audit findings that the independent auditor may have had. It was interesting because when I was doing this for the state of New Jersey, one of the things I discovered when looking at some of the local municipalities is a lot of these guys have a lot of trouble managing their petty cash funds. So they have petty cash that they can't account for. So again, it's another source of information. They need to have an audit, so that's one way. That's one thing you need to have. But it also helps inform how you may want to structure your contracts or your subrecipient agreements with grant conditions. Maybe the first grant condition you have, if you don't see a current audit, is you got to get an audit before we're going to give you money. And I suspect the state of California probably has some requirements on that as well. I hope, does that answer the question? Let me just double check. So it's 3 things. So it's the OIG, it's SAMS. The OIG is going to give you reports and findings from their investigations. SAMS is going to let you know whether or not your contractors have been debarred. And the federal audit is going to give you the actual audit for the entity with whom you may be interested in contracting.
That's perfect. Thanks, Sue. We have a question about what does liquidated damages mean, and if you could explain that and the requirements around it.
Sure. Most of your Federal Register notices that give allocations of funds require, from a contractual standpoint, as does 2 CFR Part 200, that there be a clause for what we call liquidated damages. Now, usually what that means is if there's a failure on the part of the contractor to perform, there's a financial penalty of some sort or other. And it can vary depending on the kind of a contract it is. So the one you may see most frequently, let's say we're dealing with a construction contract, is you've got a date for completion, they're running behind. So every day that they missed from the date that they were supposed to be finished, they're going to be paying an extra $100. So that's one example of a liquidated damages. There may be others. There are some states, and New Jersey, by the way, happens to be one of them, where liquidated damage clauses aren't allowed. So we figured a way around that satisfied HUD. It was more of a performance metric. and I can't, I'd have to go back and dig out one of their contracts. If you all are operating in an environment where liquidated damages for whatever reason is against state rules, then if you'll let Anne or Felicity know, I will try to dig up what we did in New Jersey that satisfied HUD but got around you got to pay this money because you didn't perform, which is basically the definition of a liquidated damage.
Great, thanks, Sue. We have one other question asking for samples of policies and procedures that the slide referred to. So particularly looking at written policies to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. And I would just say, I'll let Sue speak to this as well, but from a HCD grants management manual side, as we've developed the larger appendices that are more program specific, so economic development manual, housing activities manual, those have sample program guidelines, and it's typically within your specific program guideline that you would have language about how that program will prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. Additionally, if you happen to be working in disaster recovery, the HUD requires the state to have submitted certifications on their written policies for the prevention of fraud, waste, and abuse. So if you are a disaster grantee or an HCD rep working under the disaster program, you could start with what was submitted in financial certifications and go from there as written methods to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. Sue, do you have anything more to add?
Sure. I would say that starting out, if you look at 2 CFR 203.18 to 326, which is the procurement requirements for use of any federal funds, those, if you follow those on the procurement related issues, you're going to be in pretty good shape because those are very prescriptive. And I to Anne's point, and I think she made a good one, each program will have its own set of requirements that help you do that. Like, for example, duplication of benefits is a method for preventing fraud, waste, and abuse in beneficiary programs. Contractor oversight, things that you would build in based on the kind of a program that you're running and where you're apt to see issues. And then from the financial management standpoint, the keys are related to internal control and separation of duties so that you don't have people that are allocating funding and approving that funding and responsible for paying out that funding. They have to be very separate and to some extent firewalled functions so that there's checks and balances all the way along in your process. And I think if you have additional questions about specific programs, we'd be happy to try to answer them. I think Felicity and Anne, is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
The fraud, by the way, the fraud disclaimer on your applicant and your subrecipients is a good, that's really important to have as well, because it just reminds people, don't lie.
Yes, indeed. Good advice.
Anything else?
That's all that I'm seeing in the chat. Lori had expanded on the question of liquidated damages, asking for regulations behind that. And I do believe we addressed that in the procurement tool that was developed, Lori, but I can follow up with you after that.
That's going to be, you're going to find that in 2C. One of the things I would strongly suggest, and I do it to all the folks that we work with, is download a copy of 2 CFR Part 200 and keep it on your desktop, because it is a phenomenal reference for virtually everything, because it governs the administration of all federal funds. And there will be a section in that will also provide you with additional guidance with as it relates to liquidated damages. And it's also, once you download it, it's really easy to search it, which makes your lives a lot easier.
Yes, it's very helpful. Excellent. Well, we are at the top of the hour. Sue, I really appreciate you presenting this information. As we've said,
pleasure.
We'll be
Hopefully it was
saving this.
helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. We will save this recording. We'll get it over to HCD. We do not currently have a timeline for when it will be posted, but as soon as it is, we will share that out as a link through the office hours newsletters. So I encourage you to be registered for office hours if you're not already. And then for those that it will be mandatory, there will be an eCivis validation miscellaneous task provided with the link so that you can watch it and validate that you've seen it. Thank you all for your time. We appreciate it and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.